In this final training video, I'd like to take you through the reporting formats which we'll be using for the qualitative data collection in MIGNEX. And the main part of that is the research area interim report, within which we've included the coding scales, which will allow us to learn more and to also compare the different specific developments across all the research areas that we're having data collection in within the MIGNEX project. So in the research area interim report, there's quite a lot of pages that need to be filled in, but it's not such a huge amount of text after all which has to be written. But it's super important that you're really familiar with the template for the research area interim report before you go into the field, because that will really help you be able to focus the data collection effort and focus your time, and also just your mental energy and focus in relation to what we really need to be collecting data about in order to be able to produce the best possible research area interim report. So we have different topics in the MIGNEX project that we want to be covering, and in the qualitative data specifically we want to be trying to cover development interventions. We want to look at social protection, infrastructure, but also things like mobile phone network, which we'll very easily know just because we'll have our own mobile phones while we're doing the fieldwork. We also want to look at things that will be quite easy for us to observe, so the presence or not of international tourism, of aid, of international investments. Then we're also looking at educational expansion, gender relations, culture and traditions. We also want to specifically focus on the religious context to try and make sure we understand that in the appropriate way. We're also considering level of insecurity and violence, whether police and military and security forces are visible, very clear sort of observational data that we can quite easily get access to by doing fieldwork in the research area. Environmental degradation, similarly something which is quite easily observable and also easy to talk to people about. Vulnerability to natural disasters, people's perceptions of change over time. We also want you to try and engage with the issue of what the overall atmosphere is like. Is it an atmosphere of hope or despair, or perhaps a little bit of one or a little bit of the other, perhaps a mix depending on who you speak to. So those kinds of issues are important. There's also migration-specific things that we're looking into, so characteristics about migration, of in-migration, of return migration, and the salience in general of international out-migration as well. We also would like to tap into attitudes towards international out-migration and the perceived feasibility of international out-migration in the research area. And then there are some specific issues related to presences of migration information campaigns, so whether we see any of those, whether anyone we speak to maybe knows what they even are. And we also want to look specifically again at issues related to gender, specifically in relation to migration, and the strength of transnational ties and importance of collective remittances, again, as they appear in the research area through the data which we collect there. So through the observation, through photography, through focus groups, through key informant interviews, and in particular perhaps key informant interviews and observation and then photography are very salient to the ways in which we can approach these. For the focus group discussions, some of these things will come out very clearly, others won't, and it will vary. So therefore it's very important to think about other ways of getting this data besides the focus group transcripts, which very easily otherwise can get most of our attention, probably. We also do want to have information in the research area interim report about your experiences with the fieldwork, so how it was organised, who was there. We would like you to reflect on the seasonality and other time-specific factors that may have affected your data collection. Was it very hot? Was it in the rainy season? Were there any festivals? Those kinds of things. And also consider social and geographical contrasts within the research area, which we may or may not have been aware of in advance of the fieldwork. We also want some reflections on the focus group discussions, key informant interviews, observation, photography, and how these actually worked. What were the problems? What worked well? Lessons learned from these experiences, and other methodological aspects that we should be sharing with each other in terms of how this data will be used. And then there are specific appendices that will be attached together with the research area interim report, and there are forms to fill in here for each of the focus groups specifically, so about who was actually present, their ages, the gender in the gender divided focus groups, of course, and some other sort of basic traits of the focus group and how it went, and similarly an overview of the key informant interviews also filled in one of the appendices. We also ask for a summary and notes from each of the key informant interviews, so perhaps think of an abstract length summary. This is certainly very good to think of while you're in the field, could very well be halfway completed while you're there, saving a lot of time after. And there's also an open appendix D for additional material, so these could be selected photographs or other things that you would like to submit with the research area interim report. In the research area interim report, one of the key parts are all of these themes which I just listed, and for many of these we have coding scales which should be filled in. And these coding scales look like this, and you might take the example of major infrastructure improvement, which is the first one that we'll find, so coding scale A, and in the handbook chapter we also have an example which is illustrated there. But the point with this coding scale is to actually tick one of the boxes. And we have a line, a continuum going from 0, the existence and quality of infrastructure generally remained unchanged or worsened in the research area, which would be a 0 and a tick there, to 1, which stands for one or more forms of infrastructure has developed in ways that have transformed life in the research area. And then you tick the 1. Or you could tick one of the middle ground boxes, either closer to the unchanged or worsened, or something which has transformed life somewhat, but not as entirely as if you tick the 1. There's also then a space for you to add text which justifies and elaborates on your coding, and it addresses any other relevant aspects of the topic that we need to be thinking about. There is also an option to tick no basis, in which case it's also useful if you add some justification for why there is no basis. Perhaps the issue is just not relevant in the area, or perhaps there was not an opportunity to gather sufficient data to be able to actually assess this. However, it is very important that we try as far as possible to not tick the no basis box, because we do need to have the coding scales for as many as possible of these, for as many as possible of the research areas for this exercise to actually work. So it's also possible to tick one of them, but perhaps in your elaboration consider the sort of weakness or strength of your assessment, depending on how you judge, how well you actually know the research area and how confident you can be about your assessment here. But here it's perhaps better to be slightly on the more confident side and just tick one of the boxes, and then rather add in the justification that there might be some nuances to that which could be considered as well, rather than not ticking the box and not writing anything which gives us nothing at all to work with. There is also, in addition to the research area interim report, a need for submission of several other items from the data collection, and most saliently those are the focus group transcripts, as well as the photos of doors and the photos of the research area. And all the details about that, where to submit them exactly on the OneDrive, the links for that, and the timeline which is included for that in terms of how many weeks after completing the fieldwork it should be completed, is all also in the handbook chapter. For all of these things, though, of course, there should be a close dialogue with both Mira and also with myself in terms of any work package for data submission issues, which we can resolve together as and when needed. But as a point of departure, the timeline is set in the handbook chapter. So with that, good luck, and I'm really looking forward to receiving and processing the data and to seeing what is found in the different research areas with our different qualitative methodologies.